starts with a phone buzzing in Bogota at 3 in the morning, then another buzzing in Osaka, then one more in a quiet village outside Granada, Spain, where nothing like this has happened in living memory. Within the same handful of weeks, the ground has moved in Colombia, in Indonesia, in Japan, in Spain, and across the fault lines of the United States. Search engines are flooded with the same panicked question, typed in a dozen languages. Is the Earth breaking apart? Social media timelines are stacked with shaking security footage, collapsed apartment blocks, tsunami sirens wailing over empty beaches. And somewhere in the noise, a darker question is forming, one that governments do not want spoken out loud in public briefings. Are these earthquakes connected? Is something happening beneath our feet that the instruments have not caught up to yet? To understand what is really going on, we have to go back to the event that made 2026 impossible to ignore, a magnitude 7. 4 earthquake that tore through western Colombia and turned an ordinary Monday into a mass casualty event. On August 10th, in the department of Chaco, the ground near the town of San Jose del Palmar convulsed with a violence that seismologists rarely get to witness this close to a densely populated region. The quake registered as high as 7. 5 on some scales, a rupture deep enough and strong enough to be felt not only across western and central Colombia, but into neighboring Ecuador and Panama. Buildings that had stood for generations came down in seconds. Entire blocks in Cali and its surrounding communities were reduced to broken concrete and twisted rebar. The death toll, initially reported in the dozens, climbed relentlessly over the following days. Colombian authorities confirmed more than 300 people killed, thousands injured, and hundreds still listed as missing, buried under rubble that rescue crews were digging through by hand because heavy machinery could not reach the mountainous terrain fast enough. One image that spread across the world showed rescue workers pulling a 6-month-old baby alive from the wreckage of a collapsed building, a small miracle broadcast on a loop between images of grief that could not be looked away from. What followed the earthquake was almost as chaotic as the earthquake itself. Colombia's government, led by a newly installed and politically conservative administration, found itself accused of blocking international rescue teams tied to left-leaning governments from entering the disaster zone, an accusation the foreign ministry publicly denied. More than a dozen countries, including the United States, Japan, Mexico, Turkey, Sweden, and several Latin American neighbors, pledged humanitarian aid and specialized rescue units. But behind closed doors, a leaked letter revealed something uglier, a bureaucratic turf war over who controlled the disaster response, with the outgoing head of Colombia's National Disaster Management Unit accused of rejecting foreign assistance for political reasons in the middle of an active humanitarian catastrophe. People were still trapped under buildings, while officials argued over who got credit for saving them. It is the kind of story that never makes the international headlines the way the earthquake itself does, but it shaped how many Colombians experienced the disaster almost as much as the shaking ever did. Geologically, the Chaco earthquake was not a surprise to anyone who studies this part of the world closely. Western Colombia sits above one of the most complicated and understudied subduction zones on the planet, where the Nazca Plate is being forced beneath the South American plate at a steady, grinding pace. This is the same tectonic boundary responsible for some of the largest earthquakes ever recorded on Earth, including a 1906 quake off the coast of Ecuador that ranks among the most powerful in modern seismic history. Stress along this boundary does not release evenly. It builds in sections, locks in place for decades or centuries, and then lets go all at once, which is exactly what appears to have happened beneath Chaco in early August. But Colombia was only the loudest chapter in a much longer story that had already been building since the earlier months of 2026, and it would not be the last chapter either. Rewind further into that year, and the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as a single bad month. In February, the sequence effectively began, with the first in a string of major quakes striking across the Pacific Basin. By June, the world had already been shaken twice over. On June 7th, the Philippines absorbed a magnitude 7. 8 earthquake, one of the strongest anywhere on the planet that year, disrupting the opening day of the school calendar across Mindanao and prompting local seismologists to investigate whether the rupture originated along the highly active Cotabato Trench. Just over 2 weeks later, on June 24th, Venezuela was hit by an almost unheard-of seismic event. 2 powerful earthquakes measuring 7. 2 and 7. 5 striking in close succession, a phenomenon seismologists classify as a seismic doublet, meaning 2 quakes of comparable strength occurring nearly on top of each other in both time and location. Caracas, in the coastal state of La Guaira, absorbed the worst of it, with entire neighborhoods reduced to collapsed concrete and municipal police working alongside overwhelmed rescue teams. The following month, in July, Mexico recorded its own A7. 3 magnitude event, adding yet another entry to a year that was rapidly becoming one of the most seismically newsworthy in recent memory. By the time Colombia's turn came in August, the internet had already spent months primed to see every new quake as part of one continuous, invisible thread stitching the planet together. That framing is understandable, even if scientists keep pushing back against it. When 4 or 5 countries scattered across 3 continents all experienced destructive, high-magnitude earthquakes within a span of months, the human brain does what it always does when confronted with too much simultaneous chaos. It searches for a single cause, because a single cause feels more manageable than dozens of unrelated, indifferent tectonic systems, all releasing energy on their own separate clocks, purely by coincidence of timing. Just 5 days after Colombia buried its dead and kept digging for its missing, the Earth moved again, this time on the other side of the planet. On August 15th, a magnitude 7 earthquakes struck off the coast of Flores in eastern Indonesia. The quake was shallow, which meant its energy reached the surface with brutal efficiency, cracking homes, tearing through infrastructure, and sending coastal residents sprinting for higher ground the moment tsunami sirens began to wail. Authorities issued an urgent tsunami warning across the region, evacuating low-lying communities as emergency broadcasts crackled over radios in villages that had barely finished repairing damage from previous seismic events earlier in the year. For a tense stretch of hours, nobody knew whether a wall of water was about to follow the shaking. The warning was eventually lifted after monitoring stations confirmed no significant destructive tsunami had actually formed, a relief that came without erasing the damage already done to homes, roads, and the nerves of an entire region that has learned, generation after generation, to fear what comes after the ground stops shaking. Indonesia's vulnerability is not incidental, it is structural, quite literally. The entire archipelago sits directly on top of the meeting point of 4 major tectonic plates, the Eurasian, the Indo-Australian, the Pacific, and the Philippine Sea Plate, making it one of the single most seismically overloaded landmasses on the planet. This is the country that endured the catastrophic 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, a disaster still burned into the collective memory of coastal communities from Aceh to the eastern islands. Every time a strong quake strikes anywhere near Indonesian waters, it reactivates that memory instantly, which is exactly why the August 15th warning emptied beaches within minutes, rather than the usual sluggish public response you might see elsewhere. Indonesian disaster agencies have spent years building faster warning systems precisely because they know they may only get minutes, sometimes seconds, between the shaking and the wave. Flores was not chosen at random by geology either. Eastern Indonesia sits along a chain of volcanic islands built almost entirely by subduction, where oceanic crust from the Indo-Australian plate is thrust beneath the Sunda block at a pace that has, over millions of years, thrown up an entire arc of volcanoes stretching from Sumatra to the far side of the Banda Sea. That same violent uplift is what gives the region its lush volcanic soil and dramatic coastlines, the very things that draw tourists to islands like Komodo and Flores in the first place, and it is also precisely what makes the ground beneath those islands so unstable. Local seismologists have long flagged the waters off Flores as an area capable of producing exactly this kind of shallow, high-magnitude rupture, and the 2026 event will almost certainly be studied for years as authorities try to refine exactly how much warning time coastal communities can realistically expect the next time the sea pulls back from the shore in that unnatural telltale way that precedes a tsunami. Then there is Japan, a nation that has built its entire modern identity around learning to survive the ground turning against it. And yet, even Japan has spent 2026 on edge in a way that feels different from ordinary seismic anxiety. Earlier in the year, a powerful earthquake struck off the coast of Iwate Prefecture on the northern Pacific coast, initially estimated at magnitude 7, 4 before being revised upward, first to 7, 5, and eventually to 7. The shaking rattled buildings hundreds of kilometers away in Tokyo, prompting a tsunami warning and, more alarmingly, a special advisory from the Japan Meteorological Agency, stating that the likelihood of a subsequent, far larger earthquake was, in their words, relatively higher than during normal times. For a country that lived through the horror of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown that followed, those words are not taken lightly by anyone. There were no immediate reports of major damage from this particular quake, and monitoring later confirmed no active nuclear facilities in the affected region showed abnormalities. But the timing reignited a conversation Japan has been having with increasing urgency for years now, about the sleeping giant sitting just off its southwestern coast known as the Nankai Trough. The Nankai Trough is an 800-kilometer undersea scar running along Japan's Pacific coastline, where the Philippine Sea Plate is slowly, relentlessly sliding beneath the Japanese archipelago. Roughly every 90 to 200 years, this trough has produced some of the most devastating earthquakes in the country's recorded history. Magnitude 8 events capable of triggering tsunamis that reshape coastlines and wipe out entire towns in minutes. Japan's own government disaster modeling estimates that a full-scale Nankai Trough megaquake could kill close to 300,000 people and inflict roughly $2 trillion in economic damage. Numbers so large, they are almost impossible to process emotionally until you remember that these are not hypothetical projections, plucked from nowhere. They are based on a documented cycle stretching back more than 13 centuries. Japan's Earthquake Research Committee has repeatedly revised its 30-year probability estimate for this event, at various points placing the odds anywhere between 60 and 90%, depending on the calculation model used. New seafloor monitoring technology, using decades of geodetic data, has recently allowed scientists to map exactly which sections of the plate boundary remain locked under pressure and which have already begun creeping, giving researchers an unprecedented, though still incomplete, window into where the next rupture is most likely to originate. Earlier this summer, American and Japanese military forces even conducted a joint command exercise simulating the exact catastrophic scenario disaster planners fear most. A magnitude 8 to 9 Nankai Trough rupture followed by a tsunami slamming into southern and central Japan. A rehearsal for a disaster nobody can predict the timing of, but everybody agrees is coming eventually. This is not the first time in recent years that a single strong tremor near the Nankai zone has triggered a nationwide moment of held breath. Back in August 2024, a magnitude 7. One earthquake, centered off Miyazaki Prefecture, prompted the Japan Meteorological Agency to issue the country's first ever formal megaquake advisory, a step so unprecedented that it triggered panic buying of bottled water and emergency rations across supermarkets nationwide, even though the advisory explicitly stated it was not a prediction of an imminent quake, only a signal that background risk had ticked upward. That advisory was lifted a week later once monitoring confirmed no abnormal deep Earth movement had followed. Critics at the time argued the alert system itself may have done more to spread anxiety than genuine preparedness, since the geological reality is that Nankai ruptures have historically arrived roughly every 90 to 200 years, with the most recent pair striking in 1944 and 1946, and most serious seismologists place the realistic window for the next major event somewhere between the 2040s and the end of the century, a time frame built on average human generational patience rather than any precise clock. What the 2026 Iwate quake did was reopen that same nationwide nerve, proof that the conversation about Nankai never really goes away in Japan. It only goes quiet between tremors. If Japan and Indonesia represent the terrifying predictability of subduction zone physics, Spain represents something that unsettles people in a completely different way, because Spain is not supposed to shake like this. Throughout August, the province of Granada in southern Spain has been rattled by a persistent seismic sequence, a swarm of tremors including several quakes above magnitude 4, along with dozens of smaller aftershocks that have kept residents on edge for weeks rather than hours. Spain's National Geographic Institute has maintained continuous monitoring across the Iberian Peninsula and the Canary Islands, tracking a region that most people associate with sunny tourism, not tectonic anxiety. Southern Spain sits near the boundary where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates continue their slow, grinding collision, a boundary responsible for the devastating 1755 Lisbon earthquake that leveled much of Portugal's capital and sent tsunami waves crashing into the Iberian and North African coastlines centuries ago. Granada itself has a documented history of destructive earthquakes stretching back to medieval times, but the frequency and persistence of this particular 2026 swarm has drawn heightened scientific attention precisely because seismic sequences in this region are rare enough that any sustained activity gets treated as a signal worth watching closely rather than dismissed as background noise. What makes swarms like Granada's particularly difficult for scientists to communicate to the public is that they behave completely differently from the main shock-aftershock pattern most people intuitively understand, where one large quake is followed by a gradually fading tail of smaller tremors. A true swarm has no single dominant event, just a cluster of moderate quakes rising and falling in intensity over days or weeks, sometimes migrating slowly along a fault as underground fluids or minor stress shifts redistribute pressure from one segment to the next. That unpredictability is exactly why Spanish seismologists have resisted giving residents a simple answer about when the Granada sequence will end, because swarms, by their nature, do not follow the neat main shock-aftershock arithmetic that would let anyone forecast a clean conclusion. For a region better known globally for flamenco, the Alhambra, and Mediterranean tourism than for tectonic hazard, the sustained rattling has forced local authorities to dust off building safety inspections and emergency protocols that had not been seriously exercised in generations. And then there is the United States, where the story looks different again, not because the danger is smaller, but because it hides in plain sight behind decades of normalized small tremors that most residents have simply learned to tune out. Throughout August, California recorded dozens of earthquakes across its network of fault systems, a magnitude 4.5 near Cavlo, clusters of smaller tremors rippling through San Benito County, Kettleman City, Westmoreland, and the Southern California corridor stretching from Riverside to Anaheim. None of these individually made international news. None of them needed to. This is simply the daily rhythm of life above the San Andreas fault system, where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind past each other at a steady few centimeters a year, a slow-motion collision that occasionally erupts into sudden violent release. Seismologists studying the region around Riverside and Anaheim note that areas here experience, on average, roughly one earthquake above magnitude 6 every 10 to 20 years, a statistic that sounds almost reassuring until you remember that averages are not promises. And California's most catastrophic historical quakes, from the 1857 Fort Tejon rupture to the 1906 San Francisco disaster, did not arrive on any convenient schedule. Further north, the Cascadia subduction zone looms as an even more sobering possibility, a fault capable of producing a Nankai trough-scale megaquake along the Pacific Northwest, one that scientists have only recently begun mapping with the same seafloor geodetic techniques being pioneered in Japan. The Hayward Fault, in particular, has earned a nickname among researchers that sounds almost cinematic on its own, the Tectonic Time Bomb, because it runs directly underneath one of the most densely populated urban corridors in the country, threading beneath Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, and down toward Fremont in the East Bay. A federal disaster modeling exercise built around a hypothetical magnitude, 7 rupture on that fault projected hundreds of deaths, tens of thousands of injuries, roughly 400 simultaneous fires ignited by ruptured gas lines, and as many as 50,000 homes destroyed, a scenario researchers designed deliberately as a planning tool rather than a prophecy, precisely so that water agencies, fire departments, and hospital networks could stress test their response before the real thing arrives rather than after. What makes California's earthquake risk psychologically different from Japan's or Indonesia's is not the underlying physics, which is comparably dangerous, but the lived rhythm of it. A magnitude 2, 8, or 3. 0 tremor rattling. Riverside or Anaheim barely registers as news inside the state, filed away instantly as just another Tuesday on top of the San Andreas system. That normalization is exactly what earthquake engineers worry about most. Not the small quakes themselves, but the complacency they quietly manufacture in a population statistically overdue for something far larger. So here is the uncomfortable question that has been trending across every language on the internet this month. With Colombia, Indonesia, Japan, Spain, and the United States all rattling within weeks of each other, on top of earlier shocks in Venezuela, the Philippines, Mexico, Tonga, and Vanuatu earlier in the year, is this all one interconnected event? Is the planet somehow entering an unusually violent seismic era? The scientific answer, delivered by seismologists across multiple countries, is more measured than the headlines suggest, and it is worth sitting with because it cuts against the instinct every human brain has to find a pattern in chaos. Geophysicists studying these events have been direct about it. When earlier this year Venezuela was struck by a rare back-to-back pair of quakes measuring 7, 2 and 7, 5, within hours of a major Japanese earthquake, prompting exactly this kind of viral speculation online, Russian geophysicist Pyotr Shebelin, who directs earthquake prediction research at the Russian Academy of Sciences, told media outlets plainly that the timing was pure coincidence, with no scientific pattern linking events separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean and continental crust. Seismologists explain that a concept called stress transfer genuinely exists, where one earthquake measurably increases pressure on a nearby fault and raises the odds of a follow-up rupture. But that effect operates over distances of kilometers to at most a few hundred kilometers, not across oceans. Venezuela's quakes, notably, did not even occur along the Pacific Ring of Fire at all, but on the boundary between the Caribbean and South American plates, an entirely separate tectonic system from the one rattling Japan and Indonesia at almost the same time. What connects Japan, Indonesia, and the west coast of the Americas is not some hidden global mechanism, but simple geography, the Pacific Ring of Fire itself. A horseshoe-shaped band circling almost the entire Pacific Ocean, where roughly 90% of the planet's earthquakes and the majority of its active volcanoes are concentrated. According to the United States Geological Survey, this is where the Pacific Plate meets a dense cluster of surrounding tectonic plates, creating a nearly continuous chain of subduction zones and fault boundaries stretching from Chile and Colombia, up through Central America and the west coast of the United States, across to Alaska, down through Japan, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and onward toward New Zealand. This band is responsible for roughly 20% of all earthquakes globally measuring magnitude 6 or higher, which means that in any given month, multiple significant earthquakes striking somewhere along this ring is not an anomaly. It is close to statistical business as usual. What makes 2026 feel different is not necessarily that the ring is more active than any historical baseline, but that so many of these events have struck populated regions in rapid succession, and that modern smartphones, social media, and instant global news cycles now put every single one of them in front of billions of people within minutes, something that simply did not happen with the same intensity even 15 or 20 years ago. Spain's Granada swarm is the outlier here, sitting entirely outside the ring of fire on the separate Africa-Eurasia plate boundary, which only reinforces the point that these are independent tectonic systems, producing independent events that happen to be clustering in the same media cycle rather than the same physical mechanism. There's also a slower, quieter kind of connection between all these regions, not a mechanical one, linking fault to fault beneath the ocean floor, but an economic and social one linking disaster to disaster on the surface. Every one of these countries now faces the same brutal arithmetic in the aftermath. Colombia must decide how to rebuild Chaco, while its tourism sector in Cartagena, Medellin, and the coffee region absorbs a wave of canceled bookings from travelers spooked by news footage they saw on their phones thousands of miles away. Indonesia must reassure visitors that Flores and its neighboring islands remain safe to visit, even as tsunami sirens from mid-August still echo in recent memory. Japan must continue funding one of the most expensive disaster preparedness apparatuses on the planet indefinitely for a mega earthquake that could strike this decade or two generations from now. Spain must now budget for seismic retrofitting in a region that spent centuries treating earthquake insurance as an irrelevant formality. None of that shows up in a magnitude number, but all of it is a direct consequence of the ground refusing to stay still. None of that scientific reassurance, though, makes the human cost feel any less real, and it should not. Behind every magnitude number in this story is a family in Chaco still searching rubble for a missing relative, a fishing village in Flores that spent a night deciding whether to trust a tsunami warning that never fully materialized into disaster, but easily could have, a town in Granada where residents now sleep with shoes by the bed because the swarm has not fully stopped, and millions of people across the American West living, mostly without thinking about it, directly on top of a fault system that geologists openly describe using words like ticking time bomb. Disaster researchers who study the Hayward Fault running beneath the East Bay in California, for instance, have modeled a scenario in which a magnitude 7 rupture there alone could kill hundreds, injure tens of thousands, ignite hundreds of simultaneous fires, and leave nearly 500,000 people displaced, a level of destruction most residents driving past that fault line every day have never fully absorbed. This is the quiet, unglamorous side of earthquake science, the part that does not trend on social media the way dramatic street-level video does, the actuarial modeling of exactly how bad it could get. Done not to frighten people, but because emergency planners need numbers to plan around, water reserves to stockpile, evacuation routes to design, building codes to enforce before the ground moves rather than after. And this is precisely where the real story shifts from geology to something closer to geopolitics and human governance. Because an earthquake does not simply test the crust of the earth. It tests the competence and honesty of the institutions built on top of it. Colombia's disaster response became entangled in a political dispute over which government faction controlled foreign aid distribution, while people were still trapped alive under collapsed buildings, a delay measured in critical hours that rescue workers cannot get back. Japan, by contrast, has spent decades building one of the most sophisticated early warning infrastructures on the planet, precisely because its government has treated the Nankai Trough not as a distant hypothetical, but as an active, near-certain future event demanding continuous military-level rehearsal, building code overhaul, and public education campaigns aimed at cutting projected fatalities by as much as 80% through preparation alone. Indonesia has learned, through repeated painful experience since 2004, to build tsunami warning systems capable of emptying a coastline in minutes rather than hours. The United States, despite sitting on some of the most dangerous fault systems in the world, still largely treats earthquake risk as background noise until the moment it stops being background noise, a pattern disaster researchers have criticized for years without much political appetite to change it. Because unlike hurricanes, earthquakes give no advance warning, no 5-day forecast, no time to board up windows, only aftermath, and the decisions made or ignored in the years leading up to it. So where does that leave the question everyone keeps typing into their search bars at 3 a.m? Is the Earth entering some new violent chapter, or are we simply watching, in unusually sharp and immediate focus, the same tectonic machinery that has been grinding beneath our feet since long before any human city was built on top of it? The scientific consensus leans firmly toward the latter, A planet behaving largely as it always has, with independent fault systems releasing stress on their own unpredictable timelines, made to feel connected only by the speed and volume of modern information reaching us all at once. But consensus is not the same as certainty, and certainty is something seismology, for all its instruments and models and centuries of accumulated data, still cannot fully offer. Nobody can tell you the exact day the Nankai Trough will finally let go after 900 years of pressure. Nobody can tell you whether the Granada swarm is a passing sequence or the opening notes of something Spain has not experienced in centuries. Nobody can tell you whether the next major ring of fire rupture lands in a remote stretch of ocean nobody notices, or directly beneath a city of millions that has spent decades assuming it had more time. What we do know, from Choco to Flores, from Iwate to Granada, from the fault lines quietly humming beneath Riverside and Anaheim, is that the ground under almost every one of us is not as still as it feels on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It is simply patient, moving in increments too small to notice, until one day, in one place, nobody can name in advance, it decides it is done waiting.